It was the spring of 1952. Beneath the sidewalks of America's busiest cities, something vast and deliberate was taking shape in silence. Heavy trucks rolled through the night. Excavators chewed into bedrock. And then came the concrete, endless rivers of it poured into perfectly cylindrical forms that descended 200 feet or more into the earth. By December of that year, the work was finished. 400 concrete silos stood buried, one beneath each of more than 100 American cities, from New York to Los Angeles, Chicago to Houston, Detroit to Seattle. The official records mention them only in fragments, a line here in an Army Corps of Engineers ledger, a budget entry there under National Security Infrastructure. No master blueprint has ever surfaced. No single declassified document explains why exactly 400 were built, why they were placed where they were, or what, precisely, they were meant to hold. To understand how such a project could vanish so completely from memory, we must return to the world that demanded it. The United States had emerged from the Second World War, victorious, wealthy, and suddenly, terrifyingly alone at the top of the nuclear pyramid. In 1945, the atomic bomb had been an American secret. By 1949, it was not. The Soviet test, known as Joe 1, shattered the illusion of permanent supremacy. 2 years later, in June 1950, North Korean troops poured across the 38th parallel. American soldiers died in the snows of the Chosin Reservoir, while schoolchildren at home practiced duck-and-cover drills under their desks. The fear was no longer abstract. It had a calendar. President Truman created the Federal Civil Defense Administration in January 1951. Its mission was simple on paper: teach 70 million civilians how to survive an atomic strike. Pamphlets flooded the mail. Survival under atomic attack advised housewives to sweep radioactive dust from their curtains. Cities painted shelter signs on public buildings. But behind the public campaign, a quieter, more technical effort was already underway. Documents from the period suggest that in late 1951, a small interagency working group representatives from the FCDA, the Corps of Engineers, and elements of the newly formed Department of Defense began studying vertical hardening options. The phrase appears in a handful of surviving memos. It meant structures that could survive not just blast, but sustained siege, command posts, supply caches, perhaps even continuity of government nodes distributed far beyond Washington. The silos were never named in open congressional hearings. Funding flowed through classified line items buried inside larger defense appropriations. Construction contracts were let through shell companies and local authorities who were told only that the work was vital to national survival. The first shovels broke ground in February 1000, 952 inches lower Manhattan, near the financial district. Within weeks, similar sites appeared in Chicago's Loop, around Detroit's auto plants, beneath the rail yards of Philadelphia. By April, the pace had become almost frantic. Night shifts, floodlights, concrete trucks queuing for blocks. Engineers in hard hats spoke in low voices about psi ratings, the pounds per square inch of overpressure the structures could endure. The numbers they quietly exchanged were staggering: 200, 300, even 500 pounds per square inches, far beyond anything required for ordinary underground storage. And yet the public saw almost nothing. A short item in the Chicago Tribune on April 12 noted only that municipal crews are upgrading subsurface utilities in the central business district. No photographs, no follow-up. The same pattern repeated in city after city. The work was hidden in plain sight, swallowed by the ordinary noise of urban life. One of the few voices that survives from inside the project belongs to Thomas Riley, a structural engineer whose name appears on payroll records from the New York site. In a private letter to his wife, dated the 17th of June 1952 and later donated to a university archive, he wrote, "These are not water tanks. They are not grain elevators. The rebar schedule alone tells you they expect something far worse than a flood or a fire. Whatever they are for, it is bigger than any of us." The letter ends with a line that still chills. "I sleep better knowing they are there. I sleep worse wondering why." By midsummer, the silos had begun to take their final form. Each was a vertical cylinder roughly 35 feet in diameter, walls 3 to 5 feet thick, reinforced with concentric rings of heavy steel. Some contained multiple interior decks. Others featured massive blast doors that could be sealed from below. Ventilation shafts, filtered against radioactive particles, rose discreetly to street level disguised as utility manholes. In a few cities, Los Angeles, San Francisco seismic sensors were installed in the surrounding rock, a precaution that would not become standard for another decade. Records suggest the project was divided into three unspoken phases. Phase 1. Rapid excavation and basic structural pour. Phase 2. Internal fit-out power, air, communications. Phase 3. Sealing and handover. By October, more than 200 silos were reported complete. The Korean armistice talks dragged on in Panmunjom, while American cities quietly acquired their hidden spines. Then came the 1st of November 1952. In the Pacific atoll of Enuetak, the United States detonated Ivy Mike, the world's first hydrogen bomb. The yield was 10.4 megatons, a fireball 4 miles wide. The shockwave was felt in Hawaii. Newspapers carried the news in banner headlines, but beneath the streets the final silos were already being capped. The timing, whether coincidence or calculation, remains one of the quieter ironies of the atomic age. What happened next remains unclear. In several locations, construction logs note anomalous geological encounters. In Philadelphia, crews struck an unmapped aquifer at 180 feet and had to redesign the base overnight. In St. Louis, drilling revealed pockets of unstable shale that required additional grouting. The reports are terse, almost clinical. They do not explain why these particular sites were chosen if the ground itself posed such risks, nor do they account for the decision to proceed regardless. Some engineers later recalled being told the silos would store emergency grain and medical supplies. Others believed they were command nodes for civil defense coordinators who would emerge after an attack to organize rescue. A few whispered about missile storage, early prototypes for the underground ICBM complexes that would appear across the Great Plains years later. There is no clear consensus. What is beyond dispute is the scale of human effort. Thousands of workers, many of them veterans of the great dams and wartime shipyards, labored in shifts around the clock. Maria Lopez, a welder's assistant on the San Francisco site, remembered the experience in an oral history recorded for her union in 1987. The air down there was so still you could hear your own heartbeat. We never saw the sun for weeks at a time. They paid us double and told us not to ask questions, so we didn't. By Christmas Eve 1952, the last silo in Buffalo, New York, had been sealed. The crews dispersed. The sites were transferred to federal custodians, whose identities appear nowhere in the surviving paperwork, and for nearly 2 decades the concrete cylinders simply waited in the dark. But that wasn't the strangest part. In the years that followed, the silos faded from institutional memory with surprising speed. By 1955, the Federal Civil Defense Administration had been absorbed into larger bureaucracies. Budget lines for special vertical facilities were quietly consolidated or reclassified. Eisenhower's new-look defense policy shifted emphasis toward massive retaliation and continental air defense. The buried cylinders, once poured with such urgency, became administrative orphans. Yet, they were not entirely forgotten. Scattered maintenance logs surface in regional archives, routine inspections of sealed subsurface assets, conducted every 18 months by teams who signed non-disclosure forms they barely read. In Detroit, a 1958 report notes that silo number 47 required minor concrete patching after minor seismic activity from a distant quarry blast. In Houston, a 1961 entry records the replacement of a ventilation filter that had never been used. The language is always neutral, almost bureaucratic. Nothing suggests panic, nothing suggests urgency. The silos simply existed, like forgotten arteries beneath the skin of the Republic. What they were actually intended to contain, however, grew murkier with time. Declassified portions of a 1954 Joint Chiefs study released only in 1998 refer to distributed hardened storage nodes capable of preserving critical continuity assets for up to 6 months. Post-strike. The term continuity assets is never defined. Some historians believe it meant stocks of antibiotics, potassium iodide, and perhaps even paper records of government continuity plans. Others point to the internal volume of the silos, roughly equivalent to a small office building stacked vertically, and argue they were designed to shelter several hundred people each in rotating shifts. Still others note the presence, in a handful of sites, of reinforced mounting points that could have supported heavy machinery or communications gear. There is no clear consensus. By the early 1960s, the nuclear balance had changed again. The Soviets had tested their own hydrogen bomb. ICBMs were leaving the drawing board and entering silos of their own, only this time the American versions were in the open plains of the Midwest, not beneath city streets. The original 1952 program seemed almost quaint by comparison, and yet the urban silos remained untouched. Then, in the summer of 1962, something shifted. A routine inspection in Cleveland uncovered water seepage in one of the deeper silos. When engineers descended to investigate, they found the lower levels had become unexpectedly humid. Moisture had condensed on the cold concrete walls, forming rivulets that pooled at the base. What they found next changed the narrative entirely. Floating in that shallow pool were fragments of paper typewritten pages that had somehow escaped their sealed containers. The documents were waterlogged, but partially legible. They carried headings such as Project Long Shadow, Phase 2 inventory, and listed quantities of items that made little sense. 12,000 units, Type A, 4 dosimeters, 450 cases lyophilized plasma, and, most strangely, 17 modular Mark 7 telemetry relays. The relays were components associated with early missile guidance systems technology that would not reach operational status for another decade. The discovery was reported upward through channels that still exist only in redacted form. Within days, teams from the newly formed Office of Civil Defense arrived. The silo was pumped dry, the documents removed under armed escort, and the site resealed with fresh concrete. No public statement was ever issued. The Cleveland incident, however, appears to have triggered a quiet re-evaluation across the network. In the months that followed, similar quiet inspections occurred in at least a dozen other cities. Some silos were found bone-dry and pristine. Others showed minor corrosion or unexpected condensation. In one Los Angeles facility, inspectors reported an unexplained rise in background radiation, low but measurable, despite the absence of any radioactive material on the official manifest. The reading was logged, then classified. What happened next remains unclear. By 1965, the entire program had effectively gone dormant. Maintenance visits grew infrequent. Funding dried up. The silos entered a long twilight, their very existence slipping into the realm of rumor among a shrinking circle of aging engineers and mid-level bureaucrats. Most Americans had never heard of them. Those who had assumed they were obsolete relics of the Truman years, harmless concrete ghosts beneath the pavement. But the ghosts were not silent. In 1972, during routine subway tunnel expansion in Philadelphia, construction crews accidentally breached the outer wall of one silo. The breach was small, just enough for a worker to shine a flashlight inside. What he saw, according to the incident report later obtained through FOIA, was a perfectly preserved interior. Steel walkways still gleaming, emergency lighting fixtures intact, and rows of metal lockers lining the curved walls. Inside, the lockers, unopened for 20 years, were folded olive-drab uniforms, gas masks with fresh rubber seals, and crates stamped with faded radiation trefoils. The worker was told to forget what he had seen. The breach was patched within hours. The tunnel project continued on a slightly altered route. Stories like this began to circulate quietly among urban explorers and local historians in the 1970s and 1980s. A retired Corps of Engineers officer in Chicago spoke off the record about the 400. A former civil defense planner in Boston mentioned the vertical lifeboats. None would go on camera. None would name the exact purpose. Their reticence only deepened the mystery. And then, in the winter of 1989, the Cold War itself began to thaw. The Berlin Wall fell. The Soviet Union staggered toward dissolution. For the first time in nearly half a century, the existential dread that had justified so many secret programs began to recede. In Washington, officials started looking for ways to declare victory and reduce the nuclear arsenal. The underground silos long ignored suddenly became an administrative inconvenience. In 1992, the Department of Defense quietly commissioned a study titled Assessment of Legacy Hardened Urban Facilities. The report, portions of which were declassified in 2007, confirmed the existence of 387 intact silos, 13 fewer than the original count. The missing 13, the study noted without elaboration, had been repurposed or decommissioned during the 1970s. No further explanation was offered. The remaining structures were evaluated for possible reuse as data centers, secure archives, or even tourist attractions. Most were deemed too expensive to maintain and too risky to repurpose. The recommendation was simple: leave them sealed. But by then, the silos had already begun to speak in other ways. In 1995, during the renovation of a downtown parking garage in Seattle, workers discovered a sealed access shaft that did not appear on any city blueprints. When investigators lowered a camera, they captured images of an interior that looked almost untouched by time: a control console with 1950s-era dials, a bank of Bakelite telephones, and a wall calendar still open to October 1952. The discovery made local news for a single day before federal authorities stepped in. The site was reclassified under national security provisions. The public was told it was an old civil defense shelter, nothing more. Similar quiet revelations continued into the new century. In 2008, during preparations for the London Olympics, that was elsewhere but in Atlanta, a water main break exposed part of a silo's ventilation system. In 2014, ground-penetrating radar used for a new transit line in Denver mapped a perfect cylindrical anomaly exactly where records suggested one should be. Each time, the response was the same: acknowledgement without detail, classification without fanfare. What doesn't add up is the pattern of silence itself. Why build 400 such structures with such speed and then allow nearly all institutional memory to evaporate? Why place them beneath the densest population centers rather than in remote military reservations? Why design them to withstand pressures that exceeded even the most pessimistic estimates of Soviet warhead yields in 1952? And why, decades later, when the threat had supposedly passed, did the government show so little interest in either destroying them or putting them to new use? Some historians believe the silos were always intended as a hedge, not merely against Soviet bombs, but against the unknown. A worst-case insurance policy for a nation that had just learned the limits of its own power. Others argue they were part of an early, almost improvisational attempt at distributed command and control, an idea later perfected in the hardened bunkers of Cheyenne Mountain and the missile fields of the northern plains. A smaller group points to the internal telemetry components and suggests a connection never proven to the very beginnings of the U.S. ballistic missile program, perhaps even an abortive plan to station early Jupiter or Thor missiles vertically beneath American cities themselves. There is no clear consensus. Personal stories continue to surface, each adding texture to the shadow. Eleanor Grant, a typist in the FCDA's Washington office in 1952, recalled in a 2011 interview that she had once typed a memo listing 400 vertical units and their assigned cities. She remembered the list because the cities were not arranged alphabetically or by population, but in what appeared to be a deliberate geographic pattern, concentric rings outward from key industrial and port centers. She never saw the memo again. It was collected by a supervisor who told her, "The less you remember, the better." In 2017, the son of Thomas Riley, the engineer whose letter from the construction days had survived, donated his father's private journals to the National Archives. One entry, dated the 28th of December, 1952, reads simply, "They are finished. God help us if they are ever needed. God help us more if they are not." Today, the silos remain where they were poured 74 years ago. Most are still sealed. A few have been quietly repurposed by local utilities for fiber optic routing or emergency water storage, their original purpose politely ignored. Ground-penetrating radar and urban infrastructure projects occasionally map their ghostly outlines, but the concrete itself rarely sees daylight. Modern re-examination has brought new tools: LiDAR, isotopic analysis of the concrete, even acoustic imaging. But the answers remain stubbornly partial. The original engineering drawings have never been found. The interagency working group that conceived the project left no surviving members willing to speak on record. The silos endure as physical facts, yet their meaning feels increasingly like a question addressed to a generation that is no longer here to answer. What were they truly for? Why exactly 400? And why, after all this time, does the official record still feel deliberately incomplete? As the cities above them continue their restless expansion, new skyscrapers rising, subways tunneling deeper, populations surging, the silent cylinders wait beneath the pavement. They ask nothing. They reveal nothing. They simply stand, 400 concrete sentinels, guardians of a purpose that time has almost but not quite erased. What they might still hold, or what they might once have been ready to protect, remains one of the quieter enigmas of the American century. And in that silence, the story continues to breathe.